Bonjour, how are you all doing? Summer days have carried me quite far away from screens of any type, and it has been quite a while since I've been here. So, hello again, my name is Audrey, French born and raised with a 10-year stint in New Zealand. For those of you who are new here, I like to think of this little corner of the internet rather like a diary. A place where I gather the things I want to remember from our everyday life in the French countryside. The objects that catch my eye, old pieces with stories to tell, ideas inspired by home and gardens, little creative experiments, and the rituals and traditions that shape the days. Nothing extraordinary, perhaps, but all the small details that, when looked back upon, somehow become the things we remember most. As always, summer holidays are a time for family, friends, and making memories. But amongst all of that, I also enjoy the slightly slower rhythm that comes with having fewer things written in the diary. It gives me the chance to stay home, sort through cupboards, and finally tackle those little jobs that have been patiently waiting. And this time I was rewarded with a rediscovery, 2 antique piqués I had sourced some time ago and completely forgotten about. They had been sitting quietly waiting for their turn. After carefully soaking each piqué separately for several hours in lukewarm water with a mild detergent, I gently laid them out on the grass in the garden to dry. I made sure they were flat without pulling or tugging at the fabric and kept them away from direct sunlight. I also pulled out a couple of antique men's sleeping shirts made from hemp, which are firm favorites of mine during summer. The fabric can be quite stiff after washing, but softens beautifully as it's worn. I like rolling up the sleeves, adding necklaces and bolder jewellery, and making this very classic masculine French garment my own. My favorite trick though is to dye them in bold colors. It takes them a little further away from the sleeping shirt look, which is always a good thing when you're planning to leave the house. I have shared my usual technique for dyeing antique fabrics in a previous video, which I will link in the description box. And in the spirit of complete honesty, I should tell you that for reasons still unknown to me, I decided not to follow my own advice. I usually pre-mix the dye thoroughly with water before adding it to the washing machine, but I missed that step and the result was rather uneven, with blotchy patches appearing across both shirts. A little disappointing, of course, especially with beautiful antique pieces, but it also gave me the opportunity to try 2 different ways of correcting the color. I thought it might be useful to share, as dyeing does not always go exactly as planned, and sometimes a first result can simply become the starting point for another idea. But first, join me for a short stroll around one of my favorite neighborhoods in Saintes, the Saint-Vivien quarter. The streets were wonderfully quiet, and walking in the cool shade of the old buildings was a welcome change from the heat. I always find myself looking up here, noticing the intricate details adorning the facades, and imagining the many centuries of life these streets have quietly witnessed. home, it was time to continue experimenting with the dye. For the first shirt, I decided to work with a much darker shade. It came out of its bath a rich, warm chocolate brown. The color gave it a completely different character, elegant and a little more dramatic. I can already imagine wearing it on a summer evening with bold necklaces layered together, simple leather sandals, slicked back hair and a tan. For the second shirt, I simply used a color removing product. I initially thought this process would allow me to start afresh and dye again, but the shirt came out in the beautiful straw yellow I had originally hoped to achieve, and it was perfect like that. I was pleased to discover that both approaches worked so well. It is always useful to know that an imperfect dyeing result does not necessarily mean the end of a piece. Sometimes a darker color or simply starting again can take it in a completely different direction. Perhaps one of the gifts of summer is that it gives us a little more room for trial and error. The rest of the year can move at such a pace that we want everything to work the first time around. But summer seems more forgiving. A season for lingering a little longer over an idea, trying again when it doesn't work, changing direction halfway through, and seeing where curiosity might lead. And sometimes, as these two shirts reminded me, the second attempt is the one that was meant to happen all along. À bientôt!